Our farm wasn't just land, it was a living history book. 200 acres of rolling hills and fertile soil, nestled in a valley that had been home to my family for 5 generations. I remember my last good summer there, the summer before everything changed. I was 22 and my life was simple. It was about the satisfying ache in my muscles after a day of baling hay, the cool taste of sweet tea on the porch as the sun went down, the easy rhythm of a life lived in partnership with the seasons. I remember standing with my father, our hands calloused and worn, repairing a stretch of fence that his grandfather had first put up. "This land has a memory, Alex," he'd told me, his voice quiet, reverent. "You take care of it, and it'll take care of you." I was naive back then. I believed him. I believed that hard work and a good heart were all you needed. Our town, Harmony Creek, was the kind of place people write songs about, a place where everyone knew your name, where the annual town fair was the biggest event of the year, and at the center of it all was Mayor Thompson. He was a master of the craft, a firm handshake, a folksy, charismatic smile, a talent for remembering the names of your kids. He wasn't just a politician, he was a patriarch. He was our mayor. He spoke of progress, of a brighter future, of a town revitalization project that would bring jobs and prosperity. We all believed him. I remember when he visited the farm that summer, his shiny black car kicking up dust on our gravel road. He walked the property line with my father, his arms slung casually over his shoulder, his voice full of praise. "You've got a beautiful piece of land here, Frank," he'd said, his eyes scanning the fields, the old barn, the horizon. So much potential. Even then, a small, uneasy part of me noticed that he wasn't looking at the land with the eyes of a farmer. He was looking at it with the eyes of a developer, appraising it, measuring it, seeing not a home, but a blank canvas. Soon, the whispers started. Whispers at the local diner, in the pews at church, over the counter at the general store. The revitalization project, they said, was bigger than anyone thought. It was a golf course, a luxury housing development, and it required land, a lot of it. And our farm, our 200 acres of history, was right in the center of the proposed map. But I wasn't worried. This was Harmony Creek. This was our home. The system was fair. People were good. Mayor Thompson was our friend. I was so naive. I had no idea that we weren't about to be asked to sell. We were about to be systematically, legally, and ruthlessly erased. They didn't come for our farm with bulldozers. They came with envelopes. It wasn't a hostile takeover. It was a death by 1,000 paper cuts, each one delivered with a folksy, bureaucratic smile. The first cut came in a crisp, white envelope from the town tax assessor's office. My father opened it at the kitchen table, his brow furrowed in confusion. "This can't be right," he'd muttered, sliding the paper across the table to me. I looked at the number. Our annual property tax, usually around $4,000, had been reassessed. The new total was $12,000. The reason, printed in small, sterile font at the bottom, was a rezoning for commercial potential. We went to the town council meeting, of course. My father, a man who had never spoken in public in his life, stood at the podium, his hands trembling slightly, and explained that we were a family farm, not a commercial enterprise. The councilmen, all of them hand-picked allies of Mayor Thompson, listened with practiced, sympathetic expressions. Then they voted unanimously to deny our appeal. "The law is the law, Frank," one of them had said, his voice dripping with false regret. The second cut came a week later. A zoning officer, a man we'd known for 30 years, showed up at our door, his face apologetic. He said a routine review of town records had uncovered a violation. The new barn we'd built 5 years ago was apparently 2 feet too close to the property line. It was a minor, insignificant infraction, the kind of thing that was usually handled with a handshake and a $5 filing fee. But not this time. The notice he handed us was for a $10,000 fine, payable in 30 days. The final, fatal cut came from the bank. We'd had a small, manageable operating loan with them for as long as I could remember. But the bank's president, a man who golfed with Mayor Thompson every Saturday, had apparently decided we were suddenly a high-risk investment. They called in the loan, the full amount, due in 90 days. It was a perfect storm, a coordinated, systemic, legal assault designed to bleed us dry. And it worked. We didn't have the money. We had land, we had history, but we didn't have cash. We were drowning. The final scene of my old life took place on a cold, gray morning on the steps of the county courthouse. A small crowd had gathered for the foreclosure auction, their faces a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. I stood next to my father, his face pale, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The auction was a farce. A man in a sharp suit, someone none of us had ever seen before, made a single, insultingly low bid. No one bid against him. The auctioneer banged his gavel, the sound echoing in the cold morning air like a gunshot. Sold, he'd said. Just like that. 150 years of my family's history, gone. As the crowd began to disperse, I saw him. Mayor Thompson. He was standing across the street, partially hidden in the shadow of an old oak tree, watching. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't gloating. His face was a mask of calm, paternalistic satisfaction. This wasn't a victory for him. It was just the natural order of things. His vision moving forward. And then I heard a small, soft sigh next to me. I turned. My father was clutching his chest, his face a ghastly shade of gray. His knees buckled. I caught him as he fell, his body suddenly a dead weight in my arms. The stress, the humiliation, the loss, it had literally broken his heart. As the paramedics worked on him, as the small crowd of onlookers gasped and whispered, I looked back across the street. Mayor Thompson was gone. He had gotten what he wanted. There was no need to stay for the final act. And as I climbed into the back of the ambulance, my father's life hanging in the balance, a cold, hard resolve began to form in the ruins of my naive, idealistic heart. This wasn't just an injustice. This was a declaration of war, and I had no idea then. But I was about to spend the next 5 years of my life planning my response. My father survived, physically anyway. The heart attack left him weakened, a shadow of the strong, vibrant man he once was. But the real damage wasn't to his heart. It was to his spirit. The fight was gone. They had taken our land, and in doing so, they had taken something essential from him, something I wasn't sure he could ever get back. I stayed for a few weeks, helping my mother get him settled in the small, sterile apartment they were now forced to rent on the edge of town. The air in that apartment was thick with the smell of defeat. Every day, we would drive past the edge of our old property, where a new, garish sign had been erected. Coming soon, the estates at Harmony Creek. It was a daily, visceral reminder of everything we had lost. One evening, I found my father sitting in the dark, staring out the window at the distant lights of the town. "You should go, Alex," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "There's nothing for you here anymore. Go make a life for yourself. A real life." "I'm not leaving you," I said, my own voice tight with an anger he no longer seemed capable of feeling. He turned to look at me then, and his eyes, once so full of life and fire, were just tired. "Then you listen to me," he said, his voice firm for the first time in weeks. "You let it go. This anger. It'll eat you alive. Don't become like them. Don't let them turn you into a monster." That was the last real conversation I ever had with my father. The next morning, I packed a single duffel bag with a few changes of clothes, the small amount of cash I had to my name, and the tattered remains of my old, naive life. I was leaving Harmony Creek, and I wasn't coming back. Not as the person I was, anyway. I drove my beat-up old truck to the scenic overlook just outside of town, the same spot where kids went to watch the sunset and make out. From up there, you could see the entire valley laid out like a map. You could see the steeple of the church, the water tower, the neat little grid of streets that made up the town, and you could see our farm, my farm, a vast, dark patch of land, waiting to be carved up and sold off to strangers. I got out of the truck and walked to the edge. I pulled a folded, creased map of the town from my back pocket. I spread it out on the hood of my truck, the paper fluttering in the cool evening breeze. And with a black Sharpie, I began to circle the pillars of Mayor Thompson's little kingdom. First, I circled the town hall, the seat of his power. Then, the bank, the source of his financial leverage. And finally, the small, unassuming building that housed the Harmony Creek Herald, the local newspaper, the source of his public image, his power, his money, and his reputation. The 3 legs of the stool he had built his empire on. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't rage against the injustice of it all. The idealistic, naive boy who had believed in the fairness of the system had died on the courthouse steps. The person standing on that overlook now was someone else entirely. Someone colder. Someone more patient. My father's words echoed in my head. Don't become like them. He was wrong. To beat a monster, you couldn't just fight like one. You had to think like one. You had to become a more intelligent, more disciplined, more ruthless kind of monster. I wasn't seeking justice. Justice was a fantasy for the powerless. I was seeking utter systemic annihilation. I wasn't going to just knock him off his throne. I was going to burn the entire kingdom to the ground. I folded the map, the 3 black circles a silent, solemn vow. I got back in my truck, turned the key, and drove away, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. The 5-year clock had just started ticking. 5 years. 5 years is a long time. It's long enough for calluses to form, Not just on your hands, but on your heart. I spent those 5 years in the city, in the ruthless, unforgiving world of urban real estate. I started at the bottom, sleeping in my truck, working 3 jobs, saving every penny. I learned the language of power, the language of leveraged buyouts, of hostile takeovers, of shell corporations. The idealistic farm boy who had believed in the goodness of people was gone, buried under a mountain of spreadsheets and legal documents. I wasn't a boy anymore. I was a weapon, forged in the fires of my own anger. And I was finally ready to be aimed. I sat in my office, a sleek, minimalist space of glass and steel on the 40th floor of a skyscraper that overlooked the entire city. The view was a universe away from the rolling green hills of Harmony Creek. My suit was custom-tailored, my shoes were Italian leather, but under it all, I was still the boy who had watched his father's heart break on the courthouse steps. The vow I had made that night had been the fuel that had driven me for 5 relentless years. And now it was time to collect. My invasion of Harmony Creek didn't begin with a bang. It began with a quiet, unassuming wire transfer. I had formed a shell corporation, based out of Delaware. With a name so bland, so folksy, it would be completely invisible in a place like Harmony Creek. I called it Hickory Lane Holdings, and through my lawyer, a sharp, merciless woman from Chicago, who knew only that she was being paid an exorbitant amount of money to acquire assets in a small, rural town, I made my first move. We bought the Harmony Creek Herald. It was the weakest link in Thompson's chain, a struggling, small-town newspaper on the verge of bankruptcy. We paid cash, well over the asking price. The official press release, drafted by my lawyer and sent out under the Hickory Lane Holdings letterhead, was a masterpiece of corporate doublespeak. It promised to honor the paper's long history and restore its commitment to journalistic integrity. I watched on a live stream from the town's website as Mayor Thompson held a press conference to welcome the new investment. He stood at the podium, his face beaming, that same old charismatic man of the people smile plastered on his face. He was completely, blissfully, unaware that the ghost of the boy whose life he had destroyed was now the silent owner of his personal propaganda machine. "This is a great day for Harmony Creek," he'd boomed to a smattering of applause. "It shows that our town is a place where people want to invest, a place with a bright future." He had no idea. That afternoon, I had a conference call with the paper's new editor, a hungry young journalist I'd hired from a bigger city, a man with a talent for digging and a chip on his shoulder. "What's my first assignment?" he'd asked, his voice eager. "Your first assignment," I said, my voice calm, steady, "is to go down to the town archives. I want you to pull every single town council minute, every zoning variance, and every building permit from the last 10 years. And I want you to start building a timeline. I want to know who got rich, and how." The editor was quiet for a moment. "That's a lot of digging," he finally said. "I know," I replied, "but I have a feeling you're going to find something interesting." The first black circle on my old, tattered map now had a red line through it. The first pillar of his kingdom was now mine, and the termites were already in the foundation. My war against Mayor Thompson wasn't going to be fought with headlines alone. That was just the opening salvo. The real battle would be fought on the economic front. I wasn't just going to expose him. I was going to starve him out. I was going to buy his town out from under him, piece by strategic piece. My next acquisition, made through Hickory Lane Holdings, was the old granary at the edge of town. It was a huge, dilapidated structure that had been sitting mostly empty for years, a relic from the town's more agrarian past. To any normal investor, it was a teardown, but I knew it was the single largest commercial building in Harmony Creek. It didn't just control the last of the town's grain storage. It controlled the physical space for any potential future industry. By owning it, I controlled the town's economic future. Then, I bought the Main Street Diner, a small, unassuming little place with cracked vinyl booths and the best coffee in a 50-mile radius. It was also the town's unofficial city hall. It was where the farmers gathered at dawn, where the town councilmen held their coffee clatches, where every piece of gossip, every rumor, every secret in Harmony Creek was first whispered. Owning the diner wasn't about profits. It was about information. The new manager I hired, a quiet, observant woman from out of state, had one primary directive: keep the coffee hot and listen more than you talk. She was my ear to the ground. Finally, I moved on the regional construction supply company. I didn't buy it outright. That would have been too loud. Instead, I quietly acquired a controlling interest through a series of smaller, anonymous investments. This was the choke point. Mayor Thompson's grand vision, his estates at Harmony Creek, was being built on my family's land, and I now controlled the supply of every bag of concrete, Every 2x4, every nail and screw needed to build it, and then the squeeze began. The development project on our old farm, which had been moving along smoothly, suddenly started hitting snags. A crucial shipment of lumber was unexpectedly delayed due to a clerical error. The price of concrete from their sole supplier, my supplier, suddenly tripled, citing unforeseen market fluctuations. The project's timeline started to stretch, and the budget began to balloon. From my sleek city office, I watched it all unfold through daily reports from my lawyer and my new diner manager. She would send me snippets of overheard conversations, the frustration of the construction foreman, the growing panic of the subcontractors, the whispers about the project being cursed. Mayor Thompson, of course, was furious. I watched a live stream of a town council meeting where he stood at the podium, his face red, his usual charismatic smile replaced by a tight, angry line. He was agitated, gesturing wildly as he blamed predatory outside market forces and the failing national economy for the delays. He was a king, watching his kingdom begin to crumble, and he was completely, blissfully unaware of the ghost in the machine who was pulling all the levers. He was so busy looking for an army on the horizon that he never thought to check for the enemy already inside the castle walls. He still thought it was bad luck. He had no idea it was a coordinated, systemic, and deeply personal attack, and I was just getting started. While I was busy acquiring the physical assets of Harmony Creek, my newspaper editor, a young, hungry journalist named Ben, was digging through its memory. He spent weeks in the dusty, musty-smelling basement of the town hall, poring over a century's worth of records. He was building the timeline I'd asked for, a slow, painstaking process of connecting names to zoning variances and variances to profits. But the real breakthrough didn't come from a document. It came from a ghost. One evening, an older woman walked into the offices of the Harmony Creek Herald. Ben said she looked nervous, clutching her purse, her eyes darting around the room as if she expected to be thrown out. She introduced herself as Evelyn Reed, the former town clerk. She'd been fired by Mayor Thompson 8 years ago for gross incompetence. The whole town knew the story. Evelyn had made some clerical error, cost the town a grant, and had been unceremoniously dismissed. She had been a pariah ever since. "I read your new mission statement," she'd said to Ben, her voice a reedy whisper. "The one about journalistic integrity. I decided to believe it." She sat with Ben for 3 hours in his small, cluttered office, and she told him everything. The clerical error she'd been fired for, she explained, wasn't an error at all. She had refused to backdate a zoning permit for one of Thompson's cronies. She had refused to play the game, and for that, he had ruined her. But before she'd been escorted out of her office, a place she had worked for 30 years, she had taken an insurance policy. Evelyn had a secret, a hidden ledger. For years, she had been keeping a meticulous, handwritten record of every bribe, every kickback, every illegal land deal Thompson had ever orchestrated. She had names, dates, and dollar amounts. It was the smoking gun, the Rosetta Stone to his entire corrupt enterprise. But that wasn't the real bomb she dropped that night. His power, she explained, her voice gaining a strength Ben hadn't heard before. It's all built on a lie, the whole town government. She went on to explain that in the 1990s, Thompson and his allies had pushed through a series of amendments to the town's founding charter. They had done it quietly, illegally, without the proper public referendums. Those amendments were what gave him the almost dictatorial power he now wielded over zoning and taxation, the very power he had used to destroy my family. And then, she slid a brittle, yellowed, photostatic copy of a document across the desk. "This," she said, "is the original town charter, from 1888. She pointed a trembling finger to a paragraph of dense, archaic legal text. "And this is what he's been terrified of someone finding all these years." It was a dissolution clause, a forgotten relic of 19th century legal thinking. It stated in clear, unambiguous language that if a majority of property owners within the municipality petitioned for it, the town of Harmony Creek could be legally, officially, and permanently dissolved, with all its assets and governance reverting to the county. When Ben called me that night, his voice crackling with an excitement he could barely contain, the entire scope of my plan shifted. I had been playing checkers, trying to take his pieces off the board one by one. But Evelyn had just handed me a way to flip the entire board over. I wasn't just going to bankrupt him. I wasn't just going to expose him. I was going to unexist his entire kingdom. I was going to literally wipe his town off the map. The path, once a winding road of financial attrition, was now a straight, clear, blazing line to total erasure. And for the first time in 5 years, I allowed myself a small, cold smile. The game was about to change. Evelyn's ledger wasn't just a list of crimes. It was a roadmap. It was a detailed, hand-drawn diagram of the web of corruption Thompson had spent decades weaving. And now, armed with that map, my acquisitions became less like a blunt instrument and more like a scalpel. I was no longer just buying up assets. I was surgically excising the cancerous tumors of his network, one by one. The ledger pointed me to a 20-acre plot of undeveloped swampland just north of town. It was a mosquito-infested, muddy piece of real estate that no one had ever wanted. It was also the linchpin of Thompson's next big project, a luxury golf course. He and his cronies had been quietly buying up all the surrounding land, but they had ignored the swamp. What they didn't know, and what Evelyn's meticulous notes revealed, was that this worthless piece of land controlled the sole water rights for the entire basin. Hickory Lane Holdings bought it for a song. 2 weeks later, when Thompson's developers filed their plans for the golf course, they were politely informed by my lawyers that they had no legal access to the water needed to grow their precious greens. The multi-million-dollar project was dead on arrival. Then there was the matter of the estates at Harmony Creek, the soulless housing development being built on the bones of my family's farm. The delays they had been experiencing were about to get much, much worse. The regional construction supply company, the one I now secretly controlled, sent a formal letter to Thompson's developers. Due to exclusive new contracts, they were no longer able to supply the project with concrete at the previously agreed-upon price. The new price was triple the original quote. Non-negotiable. The panic started almost immediately. Thompson's cronies, the men who had stood by him for years, were loyal only to their own wallets. They had invested heavily in his schemes, and now those schemes were hemorrhaging money. They started to get nervous. And nervous men make mistakes. One of them, a town councilman who owned a crucial parcel of land needed for a planned strip mall, quietly put his property on the market, hoping to cut his losses and get out before the whole thing collapsed. He sold it in less than a day for cash to a very eager out-of-state investment firm. He had no idea he had just sold it directly to me. While I was quietly dismantling his empire from the inside, the Harmony Creek Herald was beginning its assault from the outside. Ben, my editor, started publishing a series of deeply researched, impeccably sourced articles. They didn't mention the mayor by name, not at first. The headlines were bland, academic-sounding. A historical review of municipal zoning practices. An analysis of tax reassessment patterns in rural communities. But the content was explosive. The articles laid out, in clear, undeniable charts and graphs, how a small, interconnected group of landowners had systematically benefited from every major town decision for the past 20 years. The town was starting to wake up. The whispers in the diner I now owned were getting louder, angrier. The narrative was shifting. Mayor Thompson was no longer the town's beloved patriarch. He was the man who had promised them a brighter future, while his own future got brighter and their taxes went up. He was losing the hearts and minds of the people he had so expertly controlled for so long. The beast was bleeding, and it was starting to get desperate, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it started to thrash. The man who had always been a master of control was finally losing it. Mayor Thompson, the folksy patriarch, the calm, steady hand on the tiller of Harmony Creek, was starting to panic. The daily reports I received from my diner manager painted a picture of a man unraveling. He was spending more and more time in his office. His door closed, his usual glad-handing tour of Main Street all but abandoned. He finally understood. This wasn't bad luck. This wasn't a series of unfortunate coincidences. This was a coordinated, systemic, and deeply personal attack, and he had no idea where it was coming from. I had built Hickory Lane Holdings to be a ghost. It was a shell corporation, wrapped in the legal armor of Delaware incorporation laws, hidden behind a series of trusts and anonymous LLCs. It was a phantom, a whisper, and it was driving him absolutely mad. My lawyer informed me that he had hired a team of expensive corporate investigators to try and pierce the veil, to find the person pulling the strings. They were hitting legal dead ends at every turn. Every inquiry they made was met with a polite, formal letter from my Chicago law firm. His frustration finally boiled over. He held a press conference on the steps of the town hall, the same place where my family's farm had been auctioned off 5 years before. I watched the live stream from my office, a grim smile on my face. The confident, charismatic leader was gone. In his place was a frantic, paranoid man, his face slick with sweat, his eyes darting back and forth as if he expected an enemy to leap out of the crowd. He blamed everything on a predatory, out-of-state corporation, a vulture capitalist who was trying to destroy our way of life. He was trying to create an external enemy, a boogeyman to rally the town against. But it wasn't working. The seeds of doubt my newspaper had been planting for months had taken root. The crowd was quiet, their faces skeptical. They were starting to wonder if the enemy wasn't some faceless corporation. But the man standing right in front of them. His desperation reached its peak a week later. At an emergency town council meeting, he tried to push through a new ordinance, a draconian measure that would give him the power to seize any property in the name of economic security through eminent domain. It was a Hail Mary, a desperate attempt to regain control. It would have given him the legal authority to take back the land I had just acquired. He made his case, his voice cracking with a frantic energy. He needed this power, he argued, to protect the town from the invisible enemy at the gates. And then the vote was called. He needed a unanimous decision. One by one, his allies, the men who had been in his pocket for years, voted yes. And then it came to the last councilman, a quiet, unassuming man named Miller, a man whose failing hardware store I had secretly bailed out 3 months ago. Miller cleared his throat. The entire room was silent. I vote no, he said, his voice barely a whisper, but it echoed in that silent room like a cannon blast. Thompson stared at him, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. He had been betrayed. His absolute power, for the first time in 20 years, had been checked. He slammed his gavel on the podium, his face purple with rage, and stormed out of the meeting. The whole town could see it now. The king was losing his grip. He was a man fighting a shadow, and the fight was driving him insane. He was becoming reckless, paranoid, and erratic. And I knew with a cold, thrilling certainty that it was almost time for the shadow to finally take a human form. It was almost time for me to come home. For the first time in 5 years, I drove my truck, a new, much nicer truck, back down the winding road that led into the valley. Harmony Creek looked smaller. The same familiar buildings, the same quiet streets. But the place that had once been my entire world now felt like a model in a museum, a relic. I had called for a town meeting, not at the town hall, his seat of power, but at the Main Street Diner, my diner. I had sent out a press release from Hickory Lane Holdings, announcing that the mysterious, out-of-state owner would finally be revealing themselves to address the community's concerns. The trap was set. I walked into the diner, and the low hum of conversation immediately died. Every head turned. A wave of stunned silence washed over the room as people processed what they were seeing. They weren't looking at a predatory corporate raider. They were looking at Alex, Frank's boy, the kid who had packed up his broken life 5 years ago and vanished. I saw the recognition, the confusion, the dawning shock on their faces. And then I saw him, Mayor Thompson. He was sitting in a corner booth, a cup of coffee in his hand, a smug, confident look on his face. He had come here to confront the boogeyman, to finally put a face to the enemy that had been tormenting him. And when his eyes met mine, his face, it was a sight I will treasure for the rest of my life. The color drained from it, leaving a pasty gray pallor. The smug confidence vanished, replaced by a look of pure, uncomprehending shock. The ghost he had been hunting wasn't a stranger. It was a ghost he had created himself. I walked to the front of the room, my boots echoing on the worn linoleum floor. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Every person in that room was leaning forward, hanging on my every word. "My name is Alex," I began, my voice calm, steady, "and I'm the owner of Hickory Lane Holdings." I let that sink in for a moment. I own this diner. I own the old granary. I own a controlling interest in the construction supply company that has been causing so many delays for the mayor's development project. I own the swampland that controls the water rights for his new golf course. And as of 9 a.m. this morning, after my final acquisition of the old Miller hardware store, I am now, officially, the majority property owner in the municipality of Harmony Creek. A collective gasp went through the room. Thompson looked like he was going to be sick. He was staring at me, his mouth slightly agape, the gears in his mind grinding, trying to process the sheer, audacious scope of what I had done. I turned my full attention to him then, my voice dropping into a lower, colder register. I let all the anger, all the grief, all the patient, calculated rage of the last 5 years seep into my words. "You built this town on a foundation of lies. Mayor," I said, my voice cutting through the silent room. "You used the law as a weapon to enrich yourself and your friends. You destroyed my family. You broke my father. You took our home." I took a step closer, my eyes locked on his. "I'm just here to call in the debt." And as the full weight of those words landed, I knew this wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about erasure. And I had the one document I needed to make that happen. The official town hall meeting was a standing room only affair. Every seat was filled, and people were lined up against the back walls, their faces a mixture of anger, confusion, and grim anticipation. They knew something momentous was about to happen. Mayor Thompson sat at the head of the long, polished table on the dais, trying to project an air of calm authority, but his knuckles were white where he gripped his gavel. He looked like a king presiding over a court that had already condemned him. When the time came for new business, I walked to the podium. I didn't look at him. I looked at the people, my former neighbors, the people who had watched in silence as my family was destroyed. "My name is Alex," I said, my voice echoing in the suddenly silent hall. "And as the majority property owner in this municipality, I am here tonight to formally submit a petition to enact the dissolution clause of the original 1888 town charter." A wave of confused murmurs washed over the room. Dissolution? What did that even mean? Before Thompson could respond, I continued. "But before we vote, I think you all deserve to see the truth, the full truth." I gestured to the side of the room. The back door opened, and Evelyn Reed, the disgraced former town clerk, walked in. She was no longer a nervous, frightened woman. She walked with a quiet, steely dignity. She took the podium as I stepped aside. "For 20 years, she began, her voice clear and strong, I watched Mayor Thompson and his cronies treat this town's treasury as their own personal piggy bank. I was fired for refusing to participate, but before I left, I made copies." She placed a thick, leather-bound ledger on the podium, and as the town's tech operator connected her laptop to the overhead projector, the pages of that secret ledger, the pages that detailed 2 decades of corruption, flashed onto the large screen behind the dais for everyone to see. Names, dates, bribes for zoning variances, kickbacks for construction contracts. It was all there, in Evelyn's neat, precise handwriting, a meticulous, undeniable record of his crimes. The room was utterly silent. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic click of the projector advancing to the next page, each one a fresh nail in the mayor's political coffin. When she was finished, I stepped back to the podium. "You have a choice," I said, my voice quiet, but carrying to every corner of the room. "You can continue to live in a corrupt, failing town, a town that exists only to enrich the man at that table, a town that preys on its own people, or you can dissolve it. You can wipe the slate clean. You can return this community to the governance of the county, a system with actual oversight, and start fresh under a government that is fair and transparent." Thompson finally found his voice. He stood up, his face a mask of purple rage, and he delivered a blustering, furious speech. He called me a liar, a traitor, a corporate vulture. He called Evelyn a bitter, incompetent old woman. He tried to rally them, to remind them of the good old days, of the man they had elected and trusted for decades. But it was too late. His power was gone. He was no longer their patriarch. He was just a common thief. And the people, his former supporters, just stared at him with cold, empty eyes. The spell was broken. The vote was called. It wasn't even close. It was a landslide. A tidal wave of quiet, righteous anger. The motion to dissolve the municipality of Harmony Creek passed, 97-3. A strange, stunned silence fell over the room. We had done it. We had just deleted a town. And as I looked at Thompson, his face a grotesque mask of shock and disbelief, I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel joy. I just felt a quiet, profound, and deeply satisfying sense of completion. The debt had been paid. The town of Harmony Creek was legally sentenced to death. The end came, not with a bang, but with the quiet, inexorable turning of bureaucratic gears. The day after the vote, the county administrators arrived. They came in a fleet of sensible sedans, a small army of accountants and lawyers and city planners, their faces impassive, their briefcases full of the legal machinery needed to dismantle a town. It was a strange, surreal week. I watched as a work crew, contracted by the county, unbolted the big green "Welcome to Harmony Creek" sign at the edge of town and loaded it onto a flatbed truck, leaving just 2 empty posts standing like lonely sentinels. The Harmony Creek Police Department, all 4 of them, were politely relieved of their duties, their badges and cars replaced by the crisp, brown uniforms and official vehicles of the county sheriff's department. Auditors in gray suits descended on the town hall, carting out boxes and boxes of financial records, their faces grim as they began to uncover the full extent of Thompson's 20-year reign of corruption. The day of his arrest was a quiet, overcast Tuesday. 2 federal agents, not county sheriffs, walked into the diner where Thompson was having his morning coffee, trying to pretend that his world wasn't collapsing around him. They didn't make a scene. They just walked up to his booth, showed him the warrant for his arrest on federal corruption charges, and quietly asked him to stand up. I was standing across the street, watching from a distance. As they led him out in handcuffs, his carefully constructed mask of the folksy patriarch finally, completely, shattered. His face was a contorted mess of pure, impotent rage. He saw me standing there, and he lunged against the agents holding him, his voice a hoarse, guttural scream. "You!" he bellowed, his voice echoing in the quiet morning air. "You did this! You'll pay for this, you hear me? You'll pay!" I didn't react. I just stood there, my face a blank mask, and watched as they pushed him into the back of an unmarked black car and drove him away. The monster who had haunted my life for 5 years was gone, and I felt nothing. Just a quiet, empty stillness. The house of cards he had built collapsed completely. The estates at Harmony Creek, the half-built, soulless monument to his greed that sat on the bones of my family's farm, was immediately seized by the county as a primary asset in the corruption investigation. The golf course was never spoken of again. His cronies on the town council were all indicted, their own dirty laundry aired out for the entire county to see. It was all over. The kingdom was gone. The king was dethroned. The system I had once so naively believed in had, in the end, been dismantled by its own rules. All that was left was the dust, and the quiet, monumental task of deciding what, if anything, would be built in its place. 6 months later, I stood on the same courthouse steps where my family's life had been shattered. This time, the auction was different. The county was selling off the seized assets of the former town of Harmony Creek. Parcel by parcel, the pieces of Thompson's corrupt empire were dismantled and sold to the highest bidder. And when the auctioneer finally got to lot number 47, the 200 acres of rolling hills and fertile soil that had once been my home, I made my bid. I didn't use a shell corporation this time. I used a new company, a transparent, publicly registered LLC, with my own name on the paperwork. I was done with shadows. I bought back my family's farm, every single acre, and I paid for it in full, with the money I had earned, not stolen. The first time I walked back onto the property, it felt haunted. The half-built skeletons of the luxury homes Thompson had planned stood like tombstones in our old north pasture. The old farmhouse, which had been used as a construction office, was dilapidated, its windows boarded up, its porch sagging. But it was mine. I brought my father back to the farm a week later. He was frailer now, and he walked with a cane. But as he stepped out of my truck and his feet touched the familiar soil, I saw a flicker of the old fire return to his eyes. He walked slowly to the porch of the old farmhouse, his hand trailing along the worn, peeling paint of the railing. He stood there for a long time, just looking out at the fields, at the distant line of trees, at the land that held the memory of his entire life. He turned to me, and his eyes were wet. He put a hand on my shoulder, his grip surprisingly strong. "You did it," he said, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't quite name. It wasn't just pride. It was recognition. He saw the man I had become, the monster I had been forced to be to reclaim what was ours. He squeezed my shoulder. "Now," he said, a small, sad smile on his face. "Let's get to work." My father's words echoed in my mind. "Don't become like them." And as I stood on that porch, I finally understood what he'd meant. The revenge was complete. The kingdom was dust. But the rage that had fueled me for 5 years was a dangerous, hollow thing to build a life on. It was time to build something new. I didn't just rebuild the farm. I went to the county planners, and with the resources and the knowledge I now had, I began to work with them. We developed a new, sustainable, community-focused plan for the entire valley. We created a land trust to protect the agricultural heritage of the area, ensuring that no single person, no corrupt mayor, could ever again wield that kind of unchecked power. We weren't just rebuilding a farm. We were rebuilding a future on a foundation of fairness and transparency. This morning, I was out in the north pasture, on a tractor, tilling the rich, dark soil. The skeletons of Thompson's failed development were gone, torn down and hauled away. The earth was a blank slate again, ready for new seeds. The sun was warm on my back. The air smelled of turned earth and diesel. And for the first time in a very, very long time, I felt something other than the cold, hard weight of my vow. I felt peace. I had razed the corrupt system to the ground. And now, finally, on my own terms, I was ready to plant something new.